Hello, my name is Tina Tarryk. Welcome to Making Known the Unknown. Our guest tonight is Sydney Schwartz, author of a book that I found most interesting, titled My First Encounter with an Angel, Revelations of Ancient Wisdom. Sydney is also a teacher, middle school teacher in New Jersey, and has written this book, this wonderful book, that I found most intriguing, dealing with the topic of Bible study and Bible research. Welcome, Sydney.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you tell me why a history teacher from New Jersey would have anything to do with Bible research, or as I understand it, psychic research, and how you came upon putting together this book?
Well, Tina, it kind of goes back 25 years ago when a friend of mine moved up to Waterford, Connecticut, and she started a job as a teacher. And in the course of her work, one of her colleagues started talking to her about psychic phenomena and mediumship. And she was very much a skeptic, and she thought that all mediums were frauds. And she decided that she was going to prove this. So she ended up making an appointment with Reverend Carl Hewitt for a reading. And she was convinced that he hires all sorts of investigators and private eyes and things like that. So she went to her friend's house, and she called in to make an appointment from her friend's house with an assumed name, and she proceeded to make the appointment. And about 2 or 3 days later, Reverend Hewitt figured out that, he picked up psychically that she was kind of pulling his leg, and he got very angry, and he called the number. Of course, Bonnie wasn't there at the time because she was down the hall, so her friend came to get her, and she had to come in and talk Carl into letting her have the reading, because Carl knew that she had given all sorts of false information. So when she did have her reading, all the information that came forth was so phenomenally true that it really blew her mind. And she called me up to tell me all about this. And I kind of always had been interested in psychic phenomena, but I was very afraid of it because I knew that a lot of times there's a lot of fraudulent people out there, and I knew I didn't have any background in this subject, so I wouldn't be able to know who was legitimate and who wasn't. So therefore, I always steered away from it, but yet I was always interested. So when Bonnie told me that this man was legitimate, I kind of interrupted her. I said, book me a reading as soon as you can. So it was Columbus Day weekend of 1976 I came up and had my first reading. And I had several readings after that. I was very impressed because what I ended up doing was when I phrased my questions, I phrased them in such a way that I only gave part of the story. And Reverend Hewitt was always able to tell me the whole story. He was filling in all the pictures and telling me all the background information that I didn't understand about it. So eventually he asked me to join his psychic development class, which I did. And I would drive up from New Jersey during the week. I'd leave school at 3 o'clock, and in those days you could get up on 95 in a couple of hours. It's not like it is today. And I would attend class, and then I'd go back to teach school the next day. And of course I was in my 20s, and I could do things like that at that point. But so I was in his class for several years, and that's how I slowly became interested in psychic phenomena. And the thing about it was that what I was learning is that it was like all the background information to the Bible studies I had as a child, because I was always drawn to the Bible. And I used to attend synagogue services every Saturday morning. And as part of the service, they would read part of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And I would, instead of listening to it in Hebrew, which I didn't understand, I would read the English translations and the commentaries that went with it. And so I had a pretty good background of the Bible, and Reverend Hewitt would tell me exactly what was going on as far as the psychic gifts, because basically the Bible is a book of psychic history. And all the major characters, like Abraham, Isaac, Moses, Samuel, all those prophets were actually mediums. And they had the gift of clairaudience, which means clear hearing. They could hear the voice of God, and they could see. Some of them could see God. They had visions, and so all this explanation made a lot of sense to me. And eventually, we ended up doing some research, putting together a production called The Golden Thread, which basically traces psychic phenomena from Abraham all the way through Jesus. All the way through the Bible, and because all those people were mediums, and trying to teach people what the gifts of the Spirit are, and where they are in the Bible. Because the thing is that if you understand the gifts of the Spirit and read the Bible, it becomes very evident that the psychic phenomena is there, because you recognize it. Because psychic phenomena is, even though it's called a pseudoscience, it does follow certain rules and certain principles. And if you understand the principles and then read the Bible, you'll see all this small evidence in the Bible which shows that the phenomena was there, and it validates that it's there. But if you don't know the phenomena, you just read right over it. And so this is what started all this.
Now, my understanding is that you actually grew up in a very Orthodox Jewish family with a very strict background, and it's a little of a surprise to me to see you actually looking into Bible research. Wouldn't that be a conflict with how you were raised, and did you have a difficult time with that at first, with any of this information that you found here?
The answer to that question is yes and no. Judaism has a tendency to allow interpretation. When you read the Bible, there are rabbis and scholars that will take a sentence, and each one will take a different point of view of what that sentence means. So interpretation is very open in Judaism, while in other religions there's only one interpretation to the Bible, and this is it. So the fact that I went out and explored a different interpretation wasn't that unusual. But the thing is that it did kind of veer away from some of the Jewish principles, and looked at some things a little bit differently.
My understanding is that the Bible is the Bible, and it should never be questioned. There should never be any issues with how it's translated. But after I've read this book, you've evidently researched some 100+ Bibles from all over the world.
Well,
how is that?
The way I grew up, that was my point of view too. I thought that the Bible was basically a perfect document because it was the Word of God, and that it was unchanged. And according to Judaism, with the Torah is a handwritten scroll. And when the scribes get done writing it all out, they roll it up from the beginning, and they start counting all the letter A's and all the letter B's throughout the whole scroll. Then they count all the thes and the ands and David, all the words to make sure everything adds up, because they want to make sure it's letter perfect. So that was a tradition that I came from. But when the book started, in other words, when I started, basically what happened with the start of this book was that Reverend Hewitt summons me to his office, and because there was an entity in spirit who wanted to speak with me, and his name was, he told me his name was an angel without a name because he wanted to remain nameless, and we call him Awan for short. Okay. And Awan told me that the Bible had been changed, and I couldn't believe that because of the way I was raised. And I argued with him quite vehemently, just like Moses argued with God at the burning bush. And so the one thing led to another, and Awan challenged me to prove him wrong. And that set me out. At one point, I started going to different libraries. I ended up in the rare book room of the Boston Public Library, where I was able to get a copy of the Coverdale Bible of 1535. And that was brought down to me, and I looked at certain passages, and I recognized that what was in that Bible was not worded the same way as the King James Bible, for example. And that older Bible was a lot more clear and a lot more psychically correct than King James. So that's when I first got my inclination that maybe the Bible was changed. And yes, since that point, well, since this book was published, the book deals with 170 different versions of the Bible. I'm now up to 250 different versions of the Bible. And they all say something different. And it's interesting because you can go through and look at compare the different Bibles, and they pretty much go along the same. You know, they change minor words here and there. But as soon as a psychic phenomenon comes around, all of a sudden the vocabulary triples and quadruples, and you have all these different ways of saying the same thing. And some of them are clearer, and some of them are less clear, and it varies quite a bit.
I noticed that as I was reading the book, there were several instances where you will put one Bible verse up against another Bible verse, yes. And you clearly explain to the reader that some statements, although they might appear the same because a word might be switched here or there, actually have a different meaning. And some are interchanged altogether, so that some are very different in the same exact paragraph in the same part of the book than others.
Two Bibles say the exact opposite of each other in certain cases, yes.
So where does that leave you in terms of thoughts about what meaning the Bible has that we all in our lives have thought is the book of books, the untouchable book that we need to heed and read?
Well, the thing is that the Bible has been changed many times. I believe anyone has told us that it's been changed 42 times before it ever even got into English, let alone what happened once it hit English. Excuse me. So therefore...
you were talking about Awan, and you were talking about the different verses in the Bible that actually some contradict each other. Where does that leave us?
Well, when you understand psychic phenomena and understand how it works, you're able to sift through a lot of the Bible and understand what's true and what's not, and what's correctly translated and what it hasn't been.
Okay. So of these 250 plus Bibles now, you're coming to some understanding of what the real meaning is when you go from one book to the other within the Bible?
True, that's true. And you know, sometimes it's interesting because when you take certain verses and then look at how it's been changed, sometimes that list of changes can create its own picture.
Okay.
And you can come up with a theory, your own idea of what's really going on here just by looking at the changes. And
as you were saying, you were actually being challenged, as I read throughout this book, to go and find or disprove what was being told to you. Now, the entity that was communicating to you, you've referred to as Awan.
Right.
And that stands for?
Angel without a name.
Okay. That sounds a little odd right there. Why would an entity come through and not want to give you its name? Did they give you a reason for that?
He explained that. He said that that Awan wasn't the first angel to come through to talk with mankind, but it seemed that every time an angel from that dimension or a spirit person from that dimension came to talk with us, humans, that people tended to start another religion. So therefore, Awan said we have over 12,000 religions on the planet, and he didn't want to be the instigation for another one. So therefore, he refused to give us his name.
Okay, I understand that. So now we have this dialogue between yourself and Awan in the book.
Yes.
And my understanding is that there needed to be another person to act as the conductor,
right,
or the translator, or the conduit, if you will,
right,
of this information.
Yes, there needed to be a medium there. Awan would come through Reverend Hewitt, who was right here, and what he does is he goes into trance, and his spirit actually leaves his body, and the spirit of Awan comes into his body, animates the vocal cords, and then Awan can speak with me. And then when the process is over, A1's spirit leaves the body, and Carl's spirit comes back into his body. And Carl's always very tired afterwards because this is a very draining experience. But we probably should talk to him more about how draining it is.
That's an amazing process. Welcome, Reverend Carl Hewitt,
My pleasure.
pastor and founder of Gifts of the Spirit Church, founded in 1977. Carl, you are the medium, it appears, while this communication is going on between A1 and Mr. Schwartz. Can you tell me a little bit about how that happens? I guess that's one place to start with this.
Well, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background, where I'm coming from. I was born and raised in North Carolina with a family. I was the 11th child, 8 boys and 3 girls. And I was the only one born with this gift, as it is known. And so there were strange things happening in the house, even when I was conceived and all the way through. So my father, being a Baptist, and the whole family were Baptist, and my father thought that anything he could not see, touch, taste, or smell was the work of the evil one, the devil, of course. And so in the time that my mother was carrying me in the womb, 9 months, my father moved 8 times in 8 different houses, because he figured that if he left this house, all these strange things wouldn't happen. And he was positive it was the devil that was, but it wasn't at all. It was the spirit people that knew me before I was placed in the womb, just like in the Bible when you read, and it said, I knew you before you were placed in the womb. And so, but I didn't understand any of this. My father didn't understand any of this, but I heard voices when I was a child that my father and mother or no one else could hear, and I really thought they lied to me, only to find out later in life that I had a gift that was called clairaudient. And I had a lot of problems with this because I couldn't find anybody that would understand me. And so I had a problem at school because there was something that happened the first day of school when I was 6 years old, because we lived in an area, a country area, farm area, and the school itself was a big, huge building, and the auditorium was right in the middle of the building, and there were great big windows way up there so it had ventilation because there was no air conditioning in those days. And so the first day of school, all of the high school from the 8th grade through the 11th would gather in the auditorium for the principal to come up on the stage and give them a pep talk. There was no PA systems in those days. And so you picture this little boy, 6 years old, going into that trance state, going out of their schoolroom, going up on the stage, because the principal was still tied up out in the office with some parents. And this little boy, in that case it was me, went up on the stage and gave them a pep talk. And the only part of it I remember is taking the first step off of the stage, and then I came out of that trance. And there was my teacher standing right there, along with all those other teachers, and they were bombarding me with questions. Where did you learn such big words? And when did you live on the banks of the Tigris River? And what do you know about the Euphrates? And how about the Jordan River and all of that? So I didn't know what they were talking about. I had no idea. And they were bombarding me. And then I finally realized that the audience is full of people, all the high school students, and they were staring at me. And my teacher reached out, because I started crying. I was so upset. I didn't know what was going on. It was crazy. So my teacher reached out, took me by the hand, took me back to the classroom, and she was giving us instructions about the bells, you know, certain bells for recess and certain bells let's come back in, that type of thing. And I was totally lost. I was hardly paying any attention. And the bells rang, and she explained that this is now we're going out for recess. And when I went out on the ground, these high school kids evidently had finished what they had to do in the auditorium because there was some lost time there. And they bombarded me. I mean, it was awful the way I was treated. And then when I got a little bit, the second grade, I heard a voice, very clear. It was just like you're hearing my voice right now. And the voice told me to go to room so-and-so and to teach the students. Now, you picture this kid now 7 years old. And so I went up to tell the teacher, and instead of her asking, who told you to go? Or what is the meaning of this? She would say nothing. She said, yes, go ahead. Even one time I remember she opened the door for me. And it was only later on that I wondered about this. Why didn't she question me? Why didn't she ask, why didn't she say, who told you to do this? How did you know to do this? And I would go into those rooms, and I would go into this altered state of consciousness, and I would tell these students in there this story, whatever I'm supposed to tell them. But I didn't know that somebody else was using my voice box and my vocal cords. And I remember distinctly coming to the door of that other room and tapping on the door, and the teacher would come, and I would say, I was told to come here and tell a story to your students. And these kids were no older than I was, by the same age. And she'd open the door, and she would sit in the back, and there I picture this little boy going up and tell him. And then she'd ask me later, I remember them asking, was your father a preacher, and did you travel in all these places? And I didn't know what to say, you see. And so this stopped, and then later on, the kids and the families treated me so badly because I was possessed. And then there was one girl that I was drawn to. Her name was Dixie, and she also had the gift. She committed suicide at 15 because she couldn't handle the harassment. At 16, I quit school, and I hitchhiked all over the Southeast, and I went to every building that had a steeple on it to get some answers. I was treated worse than a dog. I was thrown out physically, and even with all this that's going on right now here in America, I still don't have the guts to tell what happened to me in one case. But I searched everywhere to try to find answers, and I couldn't find answers. I wound up going to Florida, working for a family down there, and I tried to keep this from them, but sometimes I would be with a family, visiting with somebody, and all of a sudden I hear a voice. It would say something, a comment, for instance, about you. I would repeat it, only to find out I'm getting myself into trouble because there was no way that I could prove what I was saying, you see? Because it was someone from another dimension telling me. It was only later on that I learned that this is the gift known as the gift of clairaudient. And I remember in those days taking a Bible and going into the woods, and I was reading it, and where it says, and the voice of the Lord came to me and said this, and they wanted me to see it, read it, and then they explained to me, said, what is happening to you is no different than it's happening right here in this book. And I said, it's like I'm talking to nobody, but yet they were hearing my voice, and I said, well, I wish you'd explain that to me. They said in those days, when a person heard the voice and didn't see the entity that was talking, it was out of respect that they called that entity the Lord. This is why that word is used so many times. And the voice of the Lord came and said this, this, and this, you see? And I was very slow understanding this. And then the first medium I ever met, I heard an awful lot about, but I didn't even know what the word medium meant except something in the middle. And so this friend of mine, actually, the husband had called me and asked me what I was doing that night because I had sort of adopted them as my brother I didn't have, my sister I didn't have, because back home I was an outcast in the family. Because all these strange things happened when I was a kid, the handwriting on the wall in languages that no one could read. My father would always talk about an unknown tongue. And so I was searching everywhere to find some answers. So this friend of mine, I was 23 at this time now, and he wanted me to come by and pick them up and take me to this meeting. So I said, one time, you want me to pick you up? They didn't have a car, by the way. I had a jalopy. And so he said, the meeting is at 7:30, and you pick us up at, I thought he said pick us up at 7. And so I was a little late getting there, 10 minutes, and his wife, redhead, She was standing on the curb and she was angry because I was a little bit late. She jumped in the car and she said, I said, how come your husband is not going? And, oh, she said, it's a long story. And so we got there. The place was packed. It was packed. We couldn't find any seats. But then as part of that, I'll share some other time. But in that particular night, the speaker was a medium from New Jersey. She was around 27 or 28 years old. She went into trance, and the message, the lecture that came through her was so mind-boggling to me, because I had never heard any of those words from a physical being before. I've heard of a lot through the gift of clairaudience. I became so excited that I don't know where I was, up here in the air or sitting on my sitting down. I don't even know where I was. I was lost in time. And it was after she finished doing the lecture, and then she was invited back on the stage. She went back in that altered state, and it was after talking to about 3 or 4 families of the audience. Her head was bowed and her eyes were closed. I remember it as if it was last night. Her hand would go up like this, and it went down, and she said, the voice said, if my medium opened her eyes, she would not see the young man that we want to talk with in the back of the room. Well, in the meantime, somebody had given us some seats back there. To this day, I don't know how that happened. And anyway, there was a lady that was right over there. She was turned around and she says, young man, you're going to have to speak up because the spirit will leave and it won't give you a message. Well, all of a sudden, I was so frightened that I didn't know what to do, but that just went away like that. And I put my hand up like this, and because the lady in front of me was quite heavy set, and I was very small at the time, and so I said, you want to speak to me? And the voice said, yeah, although she was, the medium was not looking at me, her eyes were closed. And the things that she told me that night was all about where I was born, how I was treated, how I wound up where I was, and from there, and then went on into the future with me, and I didn't believe a thing that was said from that night onward in the future, such as books being written about me, articles in the paper written about me, a movie about my life. Oh, none of this. I just would not believe it. And so all of that has turned out to be true, every bit of it. And as Sidney was saying earlier there, you know, when he mentioned Moses speaking to God, well, you see, Jesus talks about this in the chapter, in book of John, chapter 4, when he talks to the lady, the woman at the well, when he said that God is spirit. Well, I use that term spirit rather than the word God, because when we mention the word God, we visualize some old man somewhere or other out in space. And yet Spirit has told me in great detail, over and over and over, as far back as I can remember, that God is within ourselves. And it is because Jesus himself was a medium. In those days they were called prophets. And this is why he was destroyed. He was killed. He was silenced.
Let me just interject something there, that Jesus never said that God is spirit. He actually said spirit is God. And in the original Greek and Latin, it both says spirit is God. And if you think about it, the way we interpret language is visually. So if you say God is spirit, most people think of this old man with a long gray beard, you know, watching the whole world. And that's what image is put into the mind. But if you say spirit is God, that's not the image that's created in the mind. Because the word spirit is kind of like a nondescript word, and the closest many people come to is thinking of Casper the Friendly Ghost. You think of someone who's ethereal, who's invisible. So the two phrases are very different from each other.
So in the last few years, I have asked questions. I've asked questions all my life because I couldn't understand, why am I hearing voices and nobody else can hear them? Why do I see visions? Why are these people in communication with me? Because there were people coming to the house to visit my parents, and all of a sudden I hear a remark made, and I repeat that remark only to get myself into trouble, because it was always about somebody there, some member of that group that came my father. There was one time that a man came selling fish, and he had an old pickup truck with a canvas across the back, and it looked like he had all ice down in there. And so I hadn't even gone to school yet. I was probably about 4 years old. And I heard a voice says, ask him how many jars of white lightning has he got under that ice. And of course my father had stopped whatever he was doing and talk with anybody, you know what I mean? And so when I asked that question, because I was a little boy, and I shook him by the sleeve, and I said, how many jars of white lightning have you got under that ice? He jumped in that truck and took off. And my father was very angry at me because I had said such a thing, because my father thought, sure, he doesn't have anything like that under that ice. And so, I don't know, sometime later that afternoon, somebody else stopped by the house and said, did so-and-so stop by here selling fish? And Daddy said, yeah. He said, he only had a few fish, but he had lots of jars of white lightning under the ice. My father looked at me. He had no answers for this, you know what I mean? So such things as that happened. And like I say, I've always asked questions. I even asked a question one time. I was in the church, I remember in the back, and I heard a voice, and it said, do you know why they say amen at the end of a prayer? And I said, no. And I remember a couple of ladies looking at me as if, who is this crazy kid talking to? And they told me that before Jesus came to the world, there was another religion, and the one that they were worshiping was Buddha, Amen. And that when he, that was a religion that didn't last more than 400 or 500 years, something like that. And that when he would step out on the balcony to talk to the people down in the courtyard, and he finished talking, he would take one step backwards and everybody would yell out his last name, Amen. And Christianity borrowed that and put it at the end of prayers so we would know that is the end of the prayer. So I've always gotten my answers, regardless of how ridiculous they were. And today I accept this, but there's one thing, I don't like the word psychic anymore, even though it does mean soul and mind. But it's been abused, it's been tainted. But there is such a thing as another part of us that we do not see, and that's the part that is found in the Corinthians. I believe it's chapter 14, dealing with the gifts of the Spirit.
12.
And that is the 15?
12.
Oh, 12, sorry, 12. So he's the one that has the memory of the Bible. He's read so many of them. And, but anyway, that I found out it was Jesus. As I have several people working with me from these other different kingdoms, Jesus needed to work with somebody back here because they shortened his life. He had demonstrated the gifts of the Spirit, so with him it was all the phenomena. And they simply said this was the miracle worker. To them, they thought that he could perform these miracles. They weren't miracles, they were gifts of the Spirit. But then after he died, he needed another medium to finish his teachings, which turned out to be in the book of Corinthians, book 1, book 2 of Corinthians. And where he said that he's talking about us having two bodies, a spiritual body and a physical body. And he explains it all in detail. But there's so many people, unfortunately, out there that do not understand this. Psychic phenomena is a natural thing. And right now there's some great mediums coming forward and demonstrating this all over the world. But before this, years ago, they were burned at the stake. They were burned at the stake, they were drowned, they were tortured, and all of this.
So you, up until the age of 23, to say the least, had nothing less than an uncharmed life, shall we say, as a child.
It's a terrible life. I lived a life of hell right here on this earth plane, this lifetime.
I think some people might look at it from the perspective that how wonderful that you could find answers to questions for everyone, but yet maybe they weren't the answers they were expecting, then maybe from a young child. And one of the many questions that I would have would come up around, your father was a pastor.
Father was an assistant pastor.
Okay.
Oh, was he religious.
And wouldn't you be able to go to his church or maybe churches in the neighborhood to find an answer? Because my understanding has been that priests are really the sources or the connections to God or the spirit world.
I hate to say this. I really do. I don't know who's going to see this tape, but I hate to say it. but they have taken something wonderful and made enormous businesses out of them. You know, money, money, money. And when they told me, the voices of Spirit told me during the 70s that I am to create a new church, new ministry, and it's going to be called Gifts of the Spirit Church. And that I did. Everything worked out exactly as they said. And the Gifts of the Spirit Church has been operating for 25 years already. And there's a lot of people that have come through and they found their answers. I'd ask no one to join the church because I just feel that everyone should be free and do whatever they want to do. But I simply say, open your mind. Think for yourself, because this is what they have told me to do. Think for yourself. They said you were born with a brain, you were born with a mind. Use it.
Tina, I'd like to add something to you, to the question that you asked. If you go back into the Bible and and read in Exodus, the first priest that was, quote, ordained would have been Aaron, and Aaron was a prophet. He was one who could hear God. So he was actually a medium, because a medium and prophet are basically mean the same thing. We use the word medium today, but in biblical times they use the word prophet. They also use the word seer. So Aaron was a medium. He was the first priest, and even in Hebrew, a priest is called a Kohen. And a Kohen technically means, even in Arabic, it means the same thing, a person who has a familiar spirit. It's a person who is a medium. Unfortunately, Aaron's sons kind of veered away from their mediumship, and they lost their ability, and they were killed. And eventually, the priesthood lost their gift of the Spirit. And from that point on, the priesthood wanted to maintain their role as the intermediary between God and the people, but they didn't have the psychic gifts to do it. And what happened was that the prophets that came about afterwards, like Samuel and Elijah and Jeremiah and Isaiah and Hosea, they all went out and they were talking to the priests, and they actually condemned the priests, saying that they didn't have the gifts and they weren't teaching the people correctly. And Jeremiah went as far as saying, because see, the priests set up this system that in order for you to communicate with God, you had to see the priest. And if you sinned, you had to bring an animal to the priest, and it would be slaughtered, and the meat would be cooked, and you would go home, and they sat down and ate the meat. It was almost like a barbecue. And so they had this system going where they didn't have to go, the priest didn't have to go out and work for a living. If, on the other hand, a person went to see the prophet, as King Jeroboam's wife did in 1 Kings 14, he told his wife to take some bread and some cracknels and some honey and go see the medium and find out if their son's going to be okay. So they were sending food to the medium in exchange for the information. So what basically was set up was an economic struggle between the priests and the mediums, because they were after a source of food. And the whole Bible can be looked in this manner. And Jeremiah went as far in chapter 7, chapter 7, he said that when he said that God told the Hebrews, he didn't tell them that he wanted sacrifices. He said he wanted them to listen to the prophets and follow and obey the prophets. So the Spirit was endorsing the prophets and not endorsing what the priests were doing. So there's always been this struggle between the priests and the prophets from biblical times all the way to this very day, between these two groups of people.
No, what's interesting, thank you, is that when I have attended church service and listened to a priest or a pastor speak about the Bible, I've never really heard once them make a reference of anyone who might be a medium, a seer, an oracle, or as you mentioned in your book, just a wise person. Why is that?
When Christianity first was established, in around 100 years after Jesus died, the church was full of people who were mediums, who were bringing the spirit messages to the people. That was part of their worship service. But then what basically happened was that that certain people got the idea that they didn't want that to happen. And the popes decided that they didn't want this to happen any longer. And they had a meeting at the Council of Nicaea in 325, where they brought all their books of the Bibles together, and they started to re-edit them, and so that all their dogmas that they were created would be in the book. But they also said something very important. They said that after Revelations came through, after John finished Revelations, that all Revelation was over, that there would be no more a prophecy that would be accepted by the church. In other words, it came to a grand halt. And therefore, since it came to a grand halt, then there would be no more mediums. Now, that was a very untrue statement, but that is what Christianity had set up, and this is why they will have nothing to do with any kind of prophet at this point.
Very interesting. Now, what happened to all those people that have these gifts who they were relying on at one point and then it appeared because it hurt their business, disappeared? It
basically, what happened was, in order for them to practice at all, they had to be underground. In 391, Theodosius, who was a Roman Empire, put out a religious reform, and he wanted to get rid of, quote, all paganism. The pagans were any religion that wasn't Christian at the time, which included all the Greek religions and the Oracle of Delphi, and many of the other religions that weren't Christian did rely on mediumship quite heavily. And they banished all them, and they basically there was groups of priests that went around, and they gave the people an option of either converting or being slaughtered. And so they drove everything underground. And even in the Middle Ages, if a woman, there's something called the witch craze that happened in the Middle Ages up to around the 1500s. And basically, women at that time, women have always been more intuitive than men. And they were the healers, they were the midwives, and this threatened the priesthood. So any woman who was caught using herbs to heal or whatever was labeled a witch, and many of them lost their lives at the stake, being burnt alive.
So now this ties in with some of the things that Carl was talking about in terms of people who are gifted being tortured or being hurt or
Yes.
having horrible things happen to them.
Excuse me, the second week of school with me, the county nurse came there and took me in the car and took me to the city, which was Wilmington, North Carolina at the time, and had my eyes tested, my ears tested to see what was wrong with me, and they couldn't find anything wrong. Then a week later, she came back again, and this time it was an extra car with 4 men in it. I found out later on that they were preachers, and she took me to Duke University, which from where I was, where we were living, to Duke was about a 5-hour ride one way. And up there they tested me too. They didn't find anything wrong with this little boy at all. So I went through hell. I really did, and I was kicked out. Well, not kicked out, but I was shunned by all of my family. As big as the family was, I was an outcast. In the family, in the church, in the community, you name it. So this is why I had to get away from there, to try to find the truth. And yet my friend, she committed suicide because she just couldn't take it anymore. And when I left and didn't go back for years, they thought that I had committed suicide too. A lot of people were shocked to see me. But I went to look for truth and I found it. And excuse me, I don't have a belief system. I have a knowingness system. I know what I'm talking about.
Now, from all of this experience and all of this background, you founded the church
Yeah.
in 1977.
I was told to find the church. I didn't want to. Because people are too difficult to work together. But I followed their advice, and when I took the bylaws that they gave me, and I put them on the desk of my lawyer's office, and he read them, and he says, "Carl, where did you get these?" I said, "Don't ask me, because you wouldn't believe me." He stared at me for a while, and he says, "I accept your answer, because I'm not going to ask you." And it took 14 months before these were cleared through the government, through the federal government, and through the state of Connecticut. And to this day, we're still meeting at the same place. I have no desire to have a cathedral. I don't ever pass the basket around twice, just one time. And I'm not doing it for the money. I'm doing it because I was born with the gift. I was put here on the earth for a reason, and so this man here has been one of my students for 25 years. I have some others that have moved all over the world practically, and their life has changed because they started using their own mind and their own brain. Simple as that.
So, Sidney, you have been a student of Carl's.
Yes, I
You were a
have.
teacher, yet you have been a student as well.
Yes, that's true.
And you've been learning through Carl for 25 years.
Yes, yes.
I'm very proud of Sidney for the simple reason he's memorized the Bible, and I'm telling you, I can't remember the Bible. So he's down in New Jersey, so sometime I want to talk about something, and I call him up and I said, this is what I want to talk about tomorrow, and I said, I can't find it, and he says, it's on chapter blah, 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 and he gives it to me, just like that. So I've had him on several other TV shows, and we do pretty good together, you know, back and forth.
Gifts of the Spirit. That's the name of the church.
Yes.
Why gifts of the Spirit? What
Because
does that mean?
you'll find it in Corinthians chapter 12, "Thou shalt not have you ignorant of the gifts of the Spirit." These are Jesus' words passed down to us through Saul. Later on, the church called him, named him Paul, and then they canonized him as a saint. He was the instrument, just as I'm the instrument between those dimensions and this planet, this earth. And he was the instrument. And all of the teachings there in that particular book, in Corinthians, that is the teachings that Jesus didn't finish because they silenced him. So he kept teaching from the other dimension. Just like you'd read about Nostradamus. Where do you think that's coming from? Nostradamus was an instrument. He was a medium.
You've spoken about clairaudience, clairvoyance. These, I understand, are some of what you refer to as gifts.
They're gifts.
What other types of gifts are they, and how do people receive these gifts?
There's a gift called remote viewing, and this is what our government has been involved in for a long time. Remote viewing is when a person goes into focus. For instance, if I was controlling you and you had that gift, I could hold up a picture in front of you of somebody that was missing. Say somebody, important person that was kidnapped. I could hold that picture in front of you. Then you'd already have a pair of blinders. I would tell you to put your blinders on and focus on that picture. Focus on the picture of this man. And pretty soon you will find yourself in another place, perhaps a city where there's only cobblestone streets. Then I would keep asking you, walk down that street and see if you can find a sign indicating the street name and tell me what language is written in. And then you go for a while, and a few moments later you said, it looks French. So then I try to find out where I am in France with you. And then if you were a good person at doing remote viewing, you would be able to still focus in on the man's picture, and then pretty soon you would see a number, a building and a number on it, and you would be able to lead the police directly to where that person is. The man from Holland, back in the 60s, I do believe, that came to the world, he was a great medium from Holland, and what's his name?
Peter Herkos.
Peter Herkos was his name. And he was a great medium. And the man down in Florida, in the southern states, Henry Belk, who owns all those department stores, he went to Holland, brought that man back here, took him to Boston, and he was the one that found the Boston Strangler.
My goodness.
Because he did remote viewing, see?
Now, you would think that all law enforcement agencies or authorities would enlist the help of people who have these gifts.
There's a lot of them that do. Last fall, when I reported something to the FBI, I was treated like a king. And years ago, I was treated like an idiot.
Really?
And that's the truth. Many of them have changed their minds. Many. So it's something that always has been, and it will always be here. The unfortunate thing, the abilities to be that gifted person has been totally wiped out of everybody's consciousness. Totally.
Now, is this something that somebody is born with?
You're born with
They
it.
can develop?
Yeah. But there's a lot of people that have the potential,
see.
and that can be developed, but that takes time. You can't read that and learn it out of a book. You got to do a lot of meditation. You got to learn to shut the body down, physical body,
So
raise the spirit.
you have students that come to your classes.
Yes.
And your classes talk about, I'm assuming, the Bible. They do some Bible study, and do you
Well,
actually
when we
have
study
students
the Bible,
develop?
we study the gifts of the Spirit that's found in the Bible.
Okay.
A lot of people read that, and they don't even understand what that means. Down south, for instance, in Charleston, South Carolina, I had a tremendous following there. And, but down there, some of those churches, they insist on people memorizing the Bible. And so when I did a program there, such as we're doing here tonight, those people listening understood what I was saying, and yet they never understood it before when they read the book. This is why I had such a great following there.
I can see now, just from what I've read of Sydney's book, that for me, the Bible has a very different meaning than what I've always understood my entire life. I know that I now can look at the Bible and know that there are other translations that actually have various meanings and some sense of what the motivation was for some of the things that were written in this book.
The thing about psychic science is that once you understand psychic science and look at the Bible, you no longer, so many people think the Bible is like a fairy tale. You know, how could this possibly happen? It's impossible. Well, when you understand psychic science and then reread the Bible, the fairy tales become demystified, and it's no longer a mystery, but it's natural law. It's following the rules of psychic science, and therefore it all becomes very understandable and much more believable.
Okay.
I have a question. I want to give a question to the people that watches this tape. You have to be very careful who you go to, because there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of frauds out there. I have sneaked into the back in the audience of places, scooched down to observe to see if these people are genuine, and many of them are not. So this is why I caution the people about this.
Let me just add something. He's not really explaining it well. Because he has clairvoyant vision, he can see the light, the auric field around a person's body. A medium's aura is different than other people's, and therefore he can recognize it. It's the saying of it takes one to know one. Because he can see the aura, he understands if they're truly a medium or not.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for being my guest today, Sydney Schwartz and Reverend Carl Hewitt, both co-authors of the book, My First Encounter with an Angel. And this is the end of the first show of a series of shows called Making Known the Unknown. Thank you for joining us.